LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, what you and I need to do now to live a long, happy, healthy life. We have something unusual for you today. For the first time in over 3 years of putting out the Next Big Idea podcast every single week, we are sharing a 2-hour conversation with one individual over the next 2 episodes, part 1 and part 2. Why are we breaking precedent? Well, Peter Attia, our guest today, is an unprecedented guy. For those of you who haven't heard of him, Peter Attia is a Stanford and NIH-trained physician, a longevity expert whose podcast has been downloaded over 60 million times, and the first guy to swim more than 17 miles from Maui to the island of Lanai and back again over open water. He is also, those facts notwithstanding, a human being, a fellow mortal who has struggled with health setbacks, a botched back surgery, and a family history of heart disease that's resulted in the early death of many of his male relatives, often in their 40s and 50s. Like so many of us, Peter has done his best to absorb available data and make informed decisions about how to eat, sleep, exercise, and live a happy, long, balanced life. Peter's process, however, as a trained physician turned McKinsey consultant turned longevity expert, has been a bit more intense than most of ours. He has become, in the last few decades, one of the leading experts on the science of longevity in the world, and the author of the new #1 New York Times bestseller, OUTLIVE, The Science and Art of Longevity. Over the course of our 2-hour conversation, we talk about the shortcomings of modern medicine, how lifestyle contributes to premature death, and his prescriptions for achieving peak fitness, nutrition, sleep hygiene, and mental health. Peter's book and our conversation has already, in the last few weeks, meaningfully changed how I approach my daily diet and exercise regime. If you want to be able to, let's say, open a jar, carry groceries, and maybe have sex when you're 90 years old, and be at the peak of your health potential today, and I have to think that's all of us, this conversation will give you the tools you need to live your life to the fullest.
If you're interested in the story behind the business headlines, check out Big Technology Podcast, my weekly show that features in-depth interviews with CEOs, researchers, and reformers in business and technology. Hi, I'm Alex Kantrowitz. I'm a longtime journalist, CNBC contributor, and the host of the show. I empty my Rolodex every Wednesday to bring you awesome episodes, so go check out Big Technology Podcast. It's available on all podcast apps. We'd love to have you as a listener.
Peter Attia, it is great to have you on the Next Big Idea podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Peter, you have built an unusual and extraordinary career. Your own personal journey seems to me to be essential to the story. Here are a few salient facts, and feel free to add and subtract from this list. You were an athlete as a teenager, a boxer. You went to medical school at Stanford, then residency at Johns Hopkins. You suffered from a botched back surgery, I think it was in your 20s, which sounded pretty scary, pretty humbling. You left Johns Hopkins after growing frustrated with what you described as the culture of resistance to innovation, and joined the McKinsey healthcare practice advising companies. You were the first person to make the round-trip swim from Maui to Lanai and back, which is astonishing to me, having snorkeled those waters. You found yourself, nonetheless, in your 30s with a dad bod that you say squeezed your sausage-like body into shirts, which stuck with me. You realized many of the men in your family died young, in their 40s and 50s, due to heart disease. You built this kind of highly original medical practice with a holistic long-term approach to improving health span You've now written the #1 New York Times bestselling book, Outlive, The Science and Art of Longevity, which, as you say, is a beast of a book. How do you think about your personal journey, and do you see the setbacks that you've encountered along the way as critical to your path and your success?
Yes, I absolutely do. And I think look, I can only comment on what I've experienced, so I can't really sort of speculate on what parallel universes look like. But I know that what I'm doing today doesn't fall out neatly from any sort of traditional medical training. If someone today asks me, which I get asked all the time by people who are, in college or medical school saying, Peter, I like what you do and I want to be doing that. What's the path? It's not entirely obvious. It's probably not doing what I did. I mean, my path couldn't have been more bizarre, but it's not like there's a specialty that you would do and say, well, I want to practice medicine 3.0 as my specialty. So after medical school, I'll do this residency. And I generally say, look, probably doing internal medicine makes the most sense, but acknowledge the fact that you're going to have to do most of your learning outside of your training. You're still going to have to learn the finer points of nutrition and exercise and sleep and true prevention outside of the confines of, a medicine 2.0 system in which we're still training. And so in that sense, yes, I think whatever setbacks I had, you mentioned many of them, of course, I can look at every one of them now and say, actually, there's a net positive that's come from all of them, including, as much as it's hard to admit, sometimes, the botched back surgery, for example. I probably still pay a price for that. I will for the rest of my life always be at higher risk for requiring a fusion, which is something I'd desperately like to avoid. But at the same time, that's given me a gift, which is an appreciation for the importance of reducing any sort of orthopedic injuries and how much your life changes when you are in a constant state of pain and immobility.
One of the things I find so interesting about your journey is that all of us are kind of armchair scientists to some degree. It's part of our job as humans, right? Like we take the information available to us in the world and we use it to navigate as well as we can to figure out how to be healthy and happy and thrive. And we're all dealing with this sort of limitation of our own experience, the historical moment we're born into, what knowledge and resources are available to us. But we're all sort of scientific experiments of one to some degree, but it's exciting and suspenseful. And it seems to me that you, to some degree, have been on this personal journey of trying to figure out how to optimize your own health and how to flourish as a human. And you've shared that journey along the way. And you've approached it with an unusual degree of kind of rigor and intensity, right? It seems like it's almost been an organic process of people kind of watching your process of figuring out what works for you, learning about how we can improve medicine in general, and how other people at scale can benefit from that. Has that felt like an organic process?
Yeah, very much so. It certainly started out as, just trying to fix the first patient. So that would have been me. And then about roughly 10 years ago, starting to figure out how to apply that to other patients. And our practice is very small, and that allows it to feel a bit like a laboratory where everything is bespoke. Everything is, we just have a luxury that I don't think we would have if we were practicing this in a traditional way. And obviously that's one of the limitations that I think many doctors have, because it's not like we're doing something other doctors don't want to be doing. I've never met a doctor who isn't doing primary care, who isn't on the front lines, who doesn't say, God, I really wish we could bring these actual tools to prevention, but the system they're in isn't really permitting it. So we feel fortunate that we can do that. And I think as an obligation, we have to be able to share that information with everybody else so that you're not just getting this information if you're Peter's patient. And that's why there's a podcast, there's a book, there's a newsletter. But I do think we have this obligation to share this so that everybody can kind of figure this stuff out on their own, and other doctors can learn what we're doing. We're not trying to be Coca-Cola here with a little secret recipe. We want everybody to know how to do this.
So you referred earlier to medicine 2.0 versus 3.0. And I think that's your term, right? That's a term that you've come up with. And I think it reflects, you described 20 years ago, as a young resident at Johns Hopkins, you felt frustrations with the medical establishment. It sounds like some of those frustrations have persisted. And you have a pretty clear vision of how our medical system is failing us and how we can make medicine better. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah. And I do think it's always helpful to start with the good, right? So medicine 1.0 is basically not medicine, but it was the thing that filled the void of medicine until medicine 2.0 came along, which I'll explain. But you alluded to something earlier, which is we're all armchair scientists. And I think that medicine 1.0 is what that looks like without the scientific method. So we have always constructed stories. That's why 500 years ago, we thought that there were gods that determined everything, where the planets were, why you got sick, bad odors. There was no scientific method. There was no understanding of science. You can't use a tool that has yet to be invented. And therefore, medicine 1.0 was largely witchcraft. By the way, sometimes that witchcraft worked. It's not like a blind squirrel can't find nuts sometimes, but it didn't work because the thinking was right. It just, you happen to stumble onto things that were via alchemy that sort of tend to work. Okay, so
and there was I'm sorry to interrupt, but there was a date before which you probably didn't want to enter a hospital, right? I mean, it would be a net negative.
Oh, for sure.
And some people have put that around early 1900s. I mean, randomized controlled testing, started to make it effective.
Certainly in the mid to late 19th century, it was problematic, right? So, if you think about, prior to antiseptic technique, prior to even local anesthetic and things like that, I mean, a hospital was a really scary place to be. But that transition where we went from the Dark Ages to where we ended up in the early 20th century, which is really when medicine 2.0 came into its own, was a remarkable transformation, largely on the basis of three things. One being, first and foremost, the elucidation of the scientific method, a la Francis Bacon in the 17th century. And then, of course, you had germ theory, aided in large part by the development of the light microscope. And then you had the development of antibiotics. And those three things, clearly not overnight, changed the face of medicine altogether. And what they did was result in a doubling of life expectancy, a literal doubling in life expectancy between 1900 and the year 2000. But if you look at the data closely, you'll realize that doubling in life expectancy came almost entirely through the reduction of what I describe as fast death. So, prior to that era, up into the early 20th century, we effectively died quickly, meaning you were doing okay and then you weren't. And it was usually infections and trauma that were the cause of death. Medicine 2.0 came along and effectively solved that problem. It didn't ever make it go away, but just made it such that you weren't constantly at the threat of death. And in the process, we started to die slowly. Chronic diseases started to dominate the landscape. And so I don't know that I like to think of medicine 2.0 as a failure. I just think medicine 2.0 was designed and built around solving fast death. But the playbook doesn't work for slow death. And you don't need me to tell you that. I mean, that's like obvious if you spend 10 minutes looking at the data. The approach of medicine 2.0, which is intervening once the problem has started, doesn't really work when it comes to cancer, heart disease, neurodegenerative disease, diabetes. Furthermore, the tools of medicine 2.0, which are largely procedural and pharmacologic, are also relatively limited when applied very late. In some cases, they're better than others. I don't want to diminish this. I mean, a person who has a heart attack today is way better off than a person who had a heart attack 50 years ago. I mean, no comparison. 50 years ago, if you had a heart attack, they were giving you aspirin, morphine, and oxygen. Today, they give you clot-busting drugs. They can stick a stent in. You're going to be on lipid-lowering therapy, which, of course, you should have been on 40 years earlier. But you've got way better odds. We've got AEDs. We've got advanced cardiac life support, all sorts of things. But, it's clear that this playbook is only going to produce incremental gains going forward. And therefore, we really need a new approach. And that's what I'm calling medicine 3.0.
And if we want evidence that the current system is failing us, I was astonished to learn that nearly, I think you say, half of Americans are diabetic or pre-diabetic.
It depends on the estimates. Those are estimates that are out there. I would say the most conservative estimate would be a third. Yeah, so call it somewhere between a third and a half.
So you've identified four primary diseases that are killing us, that we are not addressing as well as we could, and you call those the four horsemen.
Right. And all of these are diseases of modernity. So these are diseases that didn't really exist in appreciable quantities 100 years ago. Three of these diseases are what I call big death certificate tickets, meaning they're actually the ones that show up on the death certificates the most. And those are all of the diseases of atherosclerosis, which is heart disease and cerebrovascular disease. So heart attacks and strokes. That's number one by a country mile. Cancer. And then the entire suite of neurodegenerative diseases and dementing diseases. So that's everything from Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, Lewy body dementia, et cetera. Vascular dementia, all these things. So those three things account for the majority of death certificates. And that's most, I mean, if you include the entire population of smokers, you have to include COPD in there. I largely exclude that from this analysis because most people who are interested in living longer aren't smoking. So you could argue there's a fifth horseman in COPD, but for the purpose of the way I'm thinking about it, it doesn't make sense. The fourth horseman is not really a big death certificate ringer. You're not going to see him on a lot of death certificates. In fact, if you want to do the death certificate analysis, he doesn't rank in the top 5. And that's type 2 diabetes, but I expand that to include the entire spectrum of metabolic disease that is prelude to that. And that begins with hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, all the way out to type 2 diabetes. And while that spectrum of diseases, again, doesn't register at the same level as the other three horsemen, what's very important to understand is that it's the force multiplier of them all. So it's increasing your odds of each of the other three horsemen by anywhere from 50 to 100%. And so it is the insidious thing that must be controlled. You have to be metabolically healthy. That is step one of this process, right? If you want to take aim at the other three horsemen, you must address metabolic health. Your metabolic house, as I say, must be in order, and then we can begin targeting the other three in specific disease prevention strategies.
And most of us think of these diseases as something we should worry about once our doctor says, hey, you have a problem here. And the case you make is that the thresholds we have for when we treat these diseases are somewhat arbitrary, right? I think you say that once your risk of cardiovascular disease reaches 5% for the next 10 years, you're considered a treatment priority in the current system. But if it's 4%, even though there's a very clear pathway to future problems, it's you go to your annual checkup and they say, okay, you're fine, right? Which happens to me. I find it very frustrating. I say, can you please give me more nuance? I'm fine. What does that mean, right?
Yeah. So the threshold you're referring to is what's called major adverse cardiac events. So as you said, if your calculated risk for a major adverse cardiac event, so heart attack, stroke, or death, in the next decade is below 5%, yeah, primary prevention is not necessary, is deemed not necessary. Primary prevention means intervention to prevent your first heart attack, stroke, or brush with death. And it reminds me a lot of kind of the mortgage crisis in 2008. At the time I was at McKinsey, and even though, as you mentioned, I was recruited there to do healthcare, I ended up doing credit risk. So I spent my time in banks. And I write about this a little bit in the book because it also really, really shaped so much of my thinking. So in that sense, while it looks like a completely random and arbitrary detour out of medicine, being in the world of credit risk during what will go down in my lifetime as the greatest implosion of credit risk was very formative. Having formal training in risk management really shaped my thinking in many ways. And one of the most sobering lessons was that all models are wrong, some are useful. So in the credit models, when we first got in to look at, the underbelly of these companies, and we were brought in on totally separate issues. We didn't come in because they thought mortgages were a problem. We came in to help them with compliance on something else called the Basel II Accord, which was this completely dreary, sleepy thing being levied on banks in 2006 that they couldn't care less for, but they just wanted to have, consultants figure it out for them. In playing with the models that they had built, we realized a peculiar finding, which was the models couldn't anticipate or make any prediction if home prices didn't go up. In other words, every single one of these banks' models assumed home prices would monotonically rise indefinitely. And to even try to put in a negative number for home price growth, what if home prices go down 5% in the next year? The model couldn't spit out a number. You know how that story ended.
Yeah.
On the cardiovascular side, these models can't input ages below 40. So if you took a 39-year-old with a train wreck of a situation, horrible family history, lipids out the wazoo, high blood pressure, put all the risk factors you want on them, the models won't even be able to give you a 10-year risk. Because the truth of it is, even a 39-year-old train wreck is at very low risk for a 10-year event. Now, the problem with these models is they ignore causality. In other words, when you practice medicine 3.0, you have to target causal risk factors, regardless of short-term risk. This is a very important distinction that is tragically missing from medicine 2.0. And we do it in some way. So I'll give you an example of where medicine 2.0 does a very good job of this, but we're awful in most ways. So here's the only place, in my opinion, where medicine 2.0, not the only place, but this is the best example of medicine 2.0, treating the causal factor of risk. Nobody disputes that smoking is causally related to lung cancer.
Yeah.
We don't build dumb models that we show smokers to say, when your 10-year risk of lung cancer hits 5%, we're going to tell you to stop smoking. Of course not. We know that smoking is causally related, which, by the way, doesn't mean every smoker gets lung cancer. They don't. And doesn't mean that everyone who gets lung cancer is a smoker. Causality is not a one-to-one mapping, but smoking is undoubtedly causally related. We tell people not to ever smoke. And the day somebody starts smoking, we try to get them to stop. That's a medicine 3.0 approach towards lung cancer vis-a-vis smoking. We need to be doing that for every chronic disease and every modifiable risk factor. And sadly, we don't. So, that's kind of my long spiel on one of the big distinctions between 2.0 and 3.0.
How significant are the bad habits we can get into? We know that habit formation is an issue, but there's also the damage we potentially do to our bodies starting potentially as early as our teenage years into our 20s and 30s and 40s. In college, I had a friend whose father was a physician, and his advice to his son was, you know what, kid? Go out, have a great time, party, smoke, drink, do whatever you want. Then when you turn 40, clean up your act, become a health nut, because most of these conditions are reversible. I guess you would disagree with that advice?
I would, yeah. On several reasons, right? So one, you're doing a lot of damage to yourself when you're 20 and 30. That's, the analogy to me there would be telling somebody when they graduate from college and get their first job at 22, don't save a penny, don't plan for retirement, accumulate as much debt as you can, and then when you're 40, start thinking about things responsibly. There's a grain of truth to this. You should enjoy yourself when you're young and you can. I mean, I fully, buy this idea. I don't know if you've read Bill Perkins' book, Die with Zero. It's a fantastic book. I've had Bill on the podcast, and, in it, Bill talks about the importance of spending money while you can spend money. But that's not incongruent with also being responsible and planning for, the future. So on the one level, I just sort of reject that. And then the other level is, to your point, like, it's really hard to break horrible habits. The third reason I reject that advice is I reject the advice that being healthy and making healthy choices is only beneficial for the future. In fact, this is where the analogy with savings is actually not a good analogy. Because there's no question that when you're saving money today, it's a net negative today. You don't get anything out of not spending that $200 a week that you're putting into your 401k. So it's 100% downside today. And you're just sort of trying to arbitrage the hyperbolic discounting function that tells you it's going to be worth even more tomorrow. But with health, it's actually beneficial tomorrow and today. You're going to feel better when you're 30 if you're eating reasonably, not drinking excessively, and you're fit. So even if by some miracle at 40 you could turn that ship around, and I would argue it's very difficult to do so, and you're not going to erase all the damage, you've also spent 2 decades not feeling as good as you could feel. So again, you don't have to be a monk. That's certainly not what I'm suggesting. I'm not suggesting that, we be little robots who are purely optimized around health and no optimization around joy or pleasure. But obviously, I think that the advice is extreme.
Coming up after the break, Peter explains why the best way to get healthy now is to think about what you'd like to be able to do when you're old and work backwards. We'll be right back.
I'm Kwame Christian, and I am the CEO of the American Negotiation Institute, and I want you to check out my podcast, Negotiate Real Change. Listen to conversations with leaders in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, and learn the secrets behind what it really takes to become a successful advocate, ally, and change maker in your organization. Check out Negotiate Real Change on your favorite podcast player.
Hey folks, Rufus here. If you're a fan of our interviews with physicians, scientists, or entrepreneurs, then I have the perfect podcast recommendation for you, Raising Health. Previously called BioEats World, Raising Health comes from leading venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz, A16Z. Each episode, Raising Health dives deep into the heart of healthcare, biotech, and AI with A16Z general partners. Along the way, they explore the real challenges and opportunities in health and biotech entrepreneurship. Not to mention, you'll hear raw insights and actionable advice from notable guests like Omada CEO and co-founder Sean Duffy, and AI expert and In-Sitro CEO Daphne Kohler. Don't miss out. Follow Raising Health wherever you get your podcasts. You have this really interesting kind of counterintuitive framing around thinking about our health, working our way backwards, asking the question, in your last decade of life, what do you want to be able to do? Right. And you call this the centenarian decathlon, and work your way backwards to, based on what you want to do in your 90s, or if you're so fortunate to live that long, you're going to have to start making investments now in that 401k, as you say. You're going to have to change your behaviors now to be able to lift your bag and put it in the slot in front of you in the airplane, pick up your great grandkids, carry groceries. Do you want to share that logic?
I think a lot through this lens of what's called the marginal decade. So it's one of the first questions I'll ask a new patient is, what are your goals for the last decade of your life? And what are your goals for the next 12 months? That's how we frame our time together. And how do we make those congruent? So almost without exception, nobody's goals line up. So I don't know if you've ever done archery, but in archery with a compound bow, you have like a peep, which is the thing that's right in front of your eye. It's in the string when you draw back. And then you have a sight at the end of the bow, and you have to line those two up perfectly. If there's even the smallest eclipse, your arrow is going to deviate wildly. So you have to have what's called front sight, rear sight acquisition perfectly before you release the arrow. And that's how I sort of think of it. That's your 1-year goal. That's your marginal decade goal. They have to line up. Now, most people have far too lofty a set of goals in their marginal decade for what they're doing today. So, You ask people, and we do this quite formally eventually, not in the first meeting, but eventually we do this quite formally where we actually have a list of 50 things and we say, pick the 10 that are most important to you. And they're activities of daily living. They can be, very particular things to an individual. Lots of people who ski want to be able to ski when they're in the last decade of their life. And we're not here to tell them that that's an unreasonable goal. We're simply here to tell them what is the physiologic requirement to be able to do that. And then we know what the rate of decline is of these metrics. So we know how much strength declines by decade. We know how much power declines by decade. We know how much VO2 max declines by decade. So we say, well, these are the physiologic requirements for where you want to be at 90. Based on how they're declining, this is where you need to be today. Where are you? Oh, you're here. So you're higher than where you need to be at 90, but you're not nearly high enough. So it's sort of like saying, I'm in a glider and I want to get over here and I'm only here. And it's like, no, your glider's not going to make it. But the sooner you find that out, the more time you have to get that glider back up. And that's effectively what the exercise is all about.
I love this notion of aging as a glide path. I hadn't thought of it that way. And you have this list of do you want to be able to hike 1.5 miles on a hilly trail? Would you like to be able to have sex? Would you like to be able to open a jar? Right. And I think you say that most all of your patients say, actually, I'd like to be able to do all of those things. But as you say, given the glide path of what we know, we can be pretty darn confident that our capabilities will erode at a certain clip. It's very eye-opening. And I wonder whether it's interesting because it's a perspective that had never occurred to me. And I wonder if that year you spent on your back or a portion of it on your back, being unable to do the most basic things was part of what enabled you to think about what it feels like to be 95, this sense that we have to fight for this kind of basic mobility.
Yeah, it absolutely was. I have a really good friend, Rick Elias, who has also been on my podcast. Rick was one of the people who was on that U.S. Air flight that Captain Sullenberger landed in the Hudson in 2009. And Rick has given one of the most powerful, moving TED Talks you'll ever hear. It's very short. It's about 7 minutes long where he talks about that experience. I would recommend everybody stop listening to this podcast right now. Go listen to that 7-minute TED Talk and then you can come back. And in it, he talks about what a gift it was because it was inevitable that they were going to die. There's nobody on that plane who thought, we're coming out of this one. It was, it was 90 seconds of, wow, this is it. This is over. And Rick talks about that in a way that's really remarkable. But what's also amazing to me is how he says, this has been the greatest gift I've ever received.
I was given the gift of a miracle of not dying that day. I was given another gift, which was to be able to see into the future and come back and live differently.
When you get someone to take you to the end of your life, so you get to live, you get to see what exactly goes through your mind as you're dying, and then they snap your fingers and you're back and you get to do it all over again. What a gift. And so on a much smaller scale, I think that's exactly what I experienced at the age of 27, which was 3 months of not being able to walk. So just being, just laying on a floor for 3 months. My mom had to come down and literally feed me, for a year being incapacitated with pain. And that's a long enough period of time that you don't forget it. I've said this before, but my kids get a kick out of the fact that if we pull into a strip mall, I'm going to park as far away as possible just to celebrate that I love that I can walk in. I don't care if it's raining. I don't care how hot it is. I don't care how many other parking spots are closer. Let's walk because it's awesome to be able to walk, which I couldn't, right? So total gift. And I don't know that I would want everybody to experience what I went through, but maybe if they can take my word for it.
Yeah, exactly. The deathbed perspective. If the Lord wants to make a man happy, he takes away his donkey and then gives it back to him. I always like that. Okay, so we know that we have, a few levers that we can pull to achieve our health objectives, right? And we know that the big three are diet, sleep, and exercise. Mental health is also really important, and we'll talk about that. But among the physical things we can do, if you had to force rank those three levers, diet, sleep, and exercise, what do you think are the ones that are most effective in improving the health span of most people listening? How would you rank those three?
It's no question that exercise is number one. There should be no debate on that. I'm actually surprised there is. There is, by the way, but that's just because I think most people aren't familiar with the data. And I also think nutrition is so tribal and religious that people tend to get very personally attached to nutrition. And so
interesting.
There's just a lot of weirdness there. But there is no debate. That exercise is the heavyweight champion of all things that pertain to a longer, better life. And I'll explain why in a moment. As far as nutrition and sleep, I would generally put nutrition second, sleep third, but there's a caveat here, which is if your sleep is really, really bad, it could catapult to number one in the short run. And I would also say that there are examples I've seen, and I know people. I mean, I have a person who's in my life whose sleep is so bad that it actually undoes any benefit on the nutrition and exercise in her life. And she understands it. We actually spoke earlier this week, and I'm like, 4 hours a night of sleep is just not sufficient. And it is tearing you apart. And here's all the evidence why, right? But as a general rule, I would go exercise, nutrition, sleep. But the gap between exercise and the other two is a chasm. And here's the data, right? So the easiest way to imagine this is to ask the question, what are the gradations of improvement or harm that come in the extreme states of each? So let's start with nutrition. What is nutrition all about? Nutrition is all about metabolic health. So what is the most extreme state of poor nutrition? It's type 2 diabetes and obesity. So how much of a risk does that bring to an individual? And if you look at all the Cox proportional hazards, which are the statistical tools that we use to generate what are called hazard ratios, it's clear that the risk of type 2 diabetes is significant. We talked about it earlier. If you talk about all-cause mortality, it's about 30 to 50% more. And if you talk about disease-specific mortality, it can be 50 to 100% more. But let's just talk about all-cause mortality, because that's the number that matters most. This is death from anything. This includes infections, you name it. And let's say 1.4 to 1.5 is the hazard ratio. To me, that speaks to just how important nutrition is. Nutrition is a very important tool for maintaining energy balance and metabolic health. And when that's out of whack, that's how much of a hit you take. Okay. When you look at sleep deprivation or disrupted sleep, it has smaller hazard ratios than that. You're in the sort of 1.2 range to 1.3 range. So short sleep is going to come with a 20 to 30% increase in all-cause mortality. By the way, long sleep does too, probably because long sleep reflects fragmented sleep, but it may also underpin diseases. There may be some bias within that system because you may be sleeping long because of underlying disease. But now let's look at exercise. In exercise, we have three really good metrics that integrate the work that is done. And those are VO2 max, muscle mass, and strength. And I use the term integrator, which is probably foreign to people because we're not used to thinking about, calculus when we think about health. But for anybody who's taking calculus, and they'll remember what an integral function is. An integral function is a function that adds up the area under the curve. And so in physical systems, we think of this as the work that has been done. And your glucose level, if you woke up tomorrow and I checked your glucose level, that's not a great integrator of what's been happening over the past few months or years. A hemoglobin A1C is a little bit better, right? A hemoglobin A1C integrates or tells me, roughly speaking, over the past 3 months, what has your blood glucose looked like? But the actual blood glucose doesn't really tell me all that much. You could have had perfect blood glucose, but then the night before you just ate like crazy, and it's not going to look that great. But VO2 max, like there's nothing you could have done in the last day or week that is going to significantly, if your number is high, it's not high because of what you did over a day or a week or a month. It's high because of an enormous volume of training you've done. Similarly, if it's low, it's not because you had a bad night last night. It's low because you are deconditioned. The same is true for muscle mass, and the same is true for strength. These are huge integrators of work. And the differences between people who are high and low in those metrics dwarfs anything you see for nutrition and sleep. So if you have a very high VO2 max versus a very low VO2 max, so let's just say if you compare people in the bottom 25% for their age and sex to the top 2.5%, the difference is 5x, which is a 400% difference in all-cause mortality.
Astonishing.
If you talk about bottom quartile strength to top quartile strength, it's a hazard ratio of almost 3. That's nearly 200% difference. The same is true for muscle mass. So what would I take away from that? If your VO2 max, muscle mass, and strength are in the top 10% for your age and sex, you're bulletproof in terms of like your nutrition doesn't really matter that much. But now again, there's a caveat here because you wouldn't be able to get into that shape without reasonable nutrition and sleep to support it. So, there is an absolute cross-pollination of these things, but this type of analysis is what makes it so abundantly clear why, does my 17-chapter book have 3 chapters more than anything else devoted to exercise? There's no other topic that garners so much discussion and instruction because it is the most important tool that we have. And that is obviously inclusive of all pharmacologic agents.
I mean, the magnitude of this difference is kind of astonishing. And I was unaware of this before reading your book, that I believe that smoking creates something like a 40% increase in the probability of dying from
That's right.
From
Smoking is
cancer,
about,
right?
Well, no. So smoking's increases your risk of dying from lung cancer by 900%.
Okay.
However, the impact of smoking on all-cause mortality is 40 to 50%.
40 to 50%. So if it's 40%, whereas the difference between, as you just said, I think top 2.5% VO2 max versus bottom quartile is 400%. So literally, like if you take somebody who's sedentary and say, okay, you can continue to be sedentary, not get much exercise, or we can train you to get at the top of your VO2 max potential and take up smoking versus not smoke and continue to be sedentary, you'd be better off smoking
it's
a pack a day.
It's hard to know without doing the experiment, but yes, the numbers would suggest that. And by the way, a lot of people will hear us say this and say, come on, you guys are clowns. Like, who's going to get into the top 2.5%? To which I would say, well, first of all, I do believe most people can, and I've seen it because we do it with our patients, but let's put that aside. It doesn't need to be that great. Let's go from being in the bottom 25th percentile into the 3rd quartile. So let's just divide the population into bottom 25th, 25th to 50, 50 to 75, 75th to 100. Like that's, if you go from the very bottom to just the 3rd one, there's not a human being on this planet who is incapable of doing that with a little bit more training. That reduction in risk, that difference in risk that's a hazard ratio of about 2.75. That's 175% difference in all-cause mortality in any given year. So you don't have to be talking about the most extreme difference.
Yeah, the gap in perception here is so enormous. I think if I were to survey my friends, I think most of them would think that nutrition was more important than exercise.
Absolutely, I think it's what most people. I think most people believe that. That's why I just sort of I have a friend and we joke a lot about this on Twitter, which is there should be. I wish there was a way that Twitter wouldn't let you tweet anything nutrition related until you do 10 push-ups. Like you just, you got to go out and run half a mile. Then you can come and pontificate about your nutrition. If you didn't work out today for an hour, no nutrition tweeting.
Yeah, I think a push-up requirement for tweeting just in general might be great. It's probably a good idea. But I think you said that you yourself 10 years ago did not understand how much more powerful exercise was for our health. And at the time, you saw diet as maybe the biggest driver.
Absolutely. Yep. I was privy to this fallacy as well up until, probably about 6 years ago, I would say.
And this is really, I think, great news, and should hopefully listeners receive this. I mean, maybe the first response is, "Oh no, I've got to get off my ass and get to the gym," which is true. But the good news is we just had Kelly McGonigal on the show, who gave a great TED talk about. She's a social psychologist, wrote a book called The Joy of Movement. That we have this beautiful cocktail of neurochemicals that reward us for moving our bodies, right? We get this release of endorphins and endocannabinoids and myokines, which scientists call hope molecules. We feel more optimistic. We connect better with other humans. We have better brain function. So, as you say, we get these incredible kind of short-term dividends from exercise as well as sleep, for that matter, and nutrition. And then these incredibly profound long-term health benefits. So it's really kind of a no-brainer. And I thought up until reading your book, Peter, that I was had a great fitness program. And now I know I've got to double down. It's not enough. And we'll get to some of those details.
Everything you said is completely accurate, and I agree with exactly that point. And I think I describe it at some point in the book as exercise is the single most important drug we have.
Yeah, right. And if it were a pill, imagine how valuable it would be.
Well, it's funny. Everybody wants to come up with the exercise pill, and I get pitched on it about every week, right? So there's always some biotech company that, or some lab that says they've discovered this is the one molecule that's conferring all the benefits of exercise. And we've got this mouse model that demonstrates if you just infuse them with this molecule, you're going to get benefits. But the truth of it is that's never going to pan out. And the reason is there's too many things going on. That's what makes exercise so remarkable, is it is hitting so many different systems that it can't be put into a pill. So as an intervention, it has no peer. That's the good news. The bad news is you do have to do a little bit of good work. The next piece of good news is, to your point, you get all these incredible benefits in real time, and they just keep paying dividends in the long run.
So is it counteracting each of the four horsemen? I think it does impact, doesn't it? Glucose disposal,
Absolutely.
Insulin sensitivity, growth factors for neurons.
It's the single biggest needle mover on neurodegenerative disease. It's the single biggest needle mover on metabolic disease. Cancer is less clear. There's no doubt that it reduces the risk of cancer, if for no other reason, through its impact on metabolic disease. And poor metabolic health is the second biggest driver of cancer after smoking. And on cardiovascular disease, it's hard to force rank it, because cardiovascular disease has so much genetics involved. And that just necessitates the use of pharmacotherapy. So it really depends on the individual. In other words, you can be the fittest person in the world, but if your Lp(a) is through the roof, or you have familial hypercholesterolemia, you're going to need lots of drugs to address that problem. So I wouldn't be able to say in that person's case, exercise is the most important thing. I would say, pharma is, but clearly for two of the four, exercise is hands down the most important. And for the other two, it is important, but the relative weighting is going to depend on the individual.
When we come back, Peter critiques my fitness regime and shares his training tips, tricks, and secrets. I think it could be useful to take a step back and tell you a little bit more about why we do what we do at the Next Big Idea Club. We do it because our lives have been transformed by books. Fresh ideas from the world's great thinkers we find both fascinating and useful. And yet we know that books can be really long, and we have limited time. We know that you're busy. There is a universe of brilliant ideas stuck in books, trying to get out, trying to get into your ears. So we created the Next Big Idea app, which delivers the key insights from the best new books directly into your ears in only 12 minutes from the authors themselves. This part is important. Other book summary apps summarize books without permission from the authors, who deliver the heart and soul of these books. We want to give you the authentic article, and we want to help authors succeed. We want their ideas to be discovered. And we hope that after downloading our app, you will also buy their books. Every time someone downloads our app and every time someone subscribes and joins our community, it puts a bounce in the step of all of the 9 amazing members of the Next Big Idea Club team, guaranteed. You subscribe and you will put a bounce in our step, maybe 2. Please join us. Just search for Next Big Idea wherever you get your apps. There is no better way to get smart fast and no better way to put a bounce in our steps. Download the Next Big Idea app right now. Okay, and so getting into the nuts and bolts, what do we need to do to get these extraordinary benefits? What do you recommend for your typical individual in a given week?
So I usually start with the question of how much time are you willing to give to this process? People always say, well, Peter, what do you do? And it's like, that's not relevant what I do, right? Tell me what you're willing to do and we will work with that. And by the way, the math is pretty much the same for everybody. It's take whatever that number is, divide it in half. Half of that is going to be strength and stability. Half of that is going to be cardio. The strength stability should be divided such that about 80% of it is strength, 20% of it is stability. The cardio should be divided such that about 80% of it is zone 2 and 20% of it is VO2 max specific training. That in a nutshell is the simplest formula for how to divide your time in exercise. And is that going to get you the fastest marathon time? No. Is that going to help you win the local time trial series if you're a cyclist? No, not at all, right? So I'm not for a second suggesting that this is the most sport-specific way to train. I'm telling you this is the best way to train if you're trying to become a centenarian decathlete.
And so to put a finer point on it, let's say I'm 55, and let's say in my 90s, knock on wood, I'd like to be able to do everything on the list, including dance at the jazz festival in New Orleans and ski and play squash. I have historically been more focused on cardio. One of the big learnings for me reading your book is how important strength training is. But I'll very briefly give you my current workout regime because I've been optimizing, Peter, for time efficiency as a busy person. So
and that's totally fine. Yeah.
So my typical 4 days a week, I go out. I used to run 2 or 3 miles, but I've gotten it down to I've added sprints. And so I run about 2 miles with 6 all-out 45-second sprints. It used to be, I'd like to get that higher. I've been gradually increasing the length of time of the sprints. But that takes 15 minutes, to run 2 miles with 6 all-out sprints. And so that's 4 days a week. 2 days a week, I play squash for an hour, which is more intensive cardio, I think, more sustained. On the weekends, I'll do like a 3 to 4 mile longer run. And then I do like twice a week, I do minimal strength training, basically curls and benches. I know I need to do more now. So that's a start. What do you say?
So how many hours does that add up to? And like on those 2 mile sprint days, are you doing a warm up cool down or like how are you preparing yourself for those all out efforts?
I'm really not. Actually, after each sprint, I walk it off for 30 seconds.
Okay.
But I tend to, I don't do a whole lot of warm up and cool off. I've never been a big stretcher, although I realize maybe I need to modify that plan. But I think it adds up to all in 3 hours and change a week of exercise, roughly.
Okay. And are you willing to do any more?
I'm totally willing to do more. I want to have sex in my 90s.
Okay. So let's just throw a number out there and say 6 hours a week, total exercise.
Wow. Okay. Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
So how would I think about that in you? Well, again, this is very generic. This would be all modifiable based on knowing your metrics. So once I saw your VO2 max, saw your zone 2 output, I'm going to assume you'd fail our strength test miserably. And that's because most people do, even people who come at it with a strength training background. So there's not, I'm not saying that to be critical, but
it's not because you can see me on video. That's not,
no, not at all. It's just that like the test is very, very hard and the standards are very, very high because we're building the test. Our metrics are set such that everybody could do everything at 90. That's the standard we're going to hold you to. And that's why virtually everybody fails at 40. So I would say that means you're going to be doing strength training for 3 hours a week, and we would focus on some movement preparation. So we would first do a movement assessment. That movement assessment would probably demonstrate some very classic patterns, I would suspect. So I suspect you're very tight in the hamstrings. I would have to look at your breathing patterns and stuff like that. But as you recall, I write about this in the book, right? There are these sort of three different archetypes of breathing patterns, and those breathing patterns largely dictate your movement strategies. All of those movement strategies are counterproductive and they need to be corrected. So you'd spend 20% of that 3 hours on exercises to correct the movement patterns, and the remaining 80% of time strength training. Because you don't have a huge background in strength training, we're not going to get too fancy. It would probably be 3 whole body workouts a week. We're not going to do an upper lower split. We're also not going to, we're going to start you doing a lot of single leg exercises. This is very important for runners. So, running is a single leg activity, right? Each leg is doing it, is impacting forceful on its own and receiving force on its own. So you're not, a squat and a deadlift are kind of not natural exercises in that sense to a runner. So you're going to be learning a lot of new exercises, mostly variations of split squats, single leg RDLs, things like that. So these are much safer exercises as well for somebody who doesn't come into this with a huge background of strength training. On the cardio side, what are we going to do? Well, the good news is you've already got an awesome base there. I think what we're going to do is widen the base of your pyramid, because right now, just on what you described, you got a little too much peak intensity, not enough base building. So of that 3 hours, I actually want 80% of that to be at zone 2, which is an intensity at which you can run and still carry out a conversation. And given your level of fitness, that's still going to be probably a decent clip. You're probably, I'm guessing, but that might be like, 8-minute miles for you or something like that. It's not, it has to be brisk enough that there's a training effect. So if you can talk easily, that's actually too low in intensity. If you can't talk at all, which obviously you can't during a lot of your higher intensity stuff, then that's too much. So 80% of those miles are going to be run right at that zone 2 level. And then the other 20%, I'm actually going to take you back to intervals, but they're going to be longer intervals. So we're going to really optimize around around VO2 max. And so what I'd probably have you do, depending on how fast you are, is do 3-minute intervals. So I'd have you go as hard as you can for 3 minutes, walk for 3 minutes, as hard as you can for 3 minutes, walk for 3 minutes. And we'll push that up to 4. And you only do that once a week. And that's going to be the toughest workout you do a week, both in the weight room or on the track. That one workout, we would optimize the other workouts around that one being your highest performance workout a week. We would structure your rest around that. We would structure everything around you being able to give it your all and leave it on the table for that one workout.
And so I'm guessing the reason that you had that your answer to the question, what's the optimal workout, is sort of about the time that a typical person listening to this can allocate, is probably because there are many people who would think 6 hours of working out a week, that's a non-starter, right? And we know that there's the opportunity for a virtuous cycle here, partly because of what we described about the great joy of how good you feel when you exercise. So really what we want to do is get people on a kind of virtuous cycle of exercising more and more and more. And would you say that it sounds like you probably work out even more than what you just described, more than 6 hours a week? I mean, would you say that the average person should be getting on a pathway to incrementally increase their both cardio and strength training up until they get to a kind of a total of 6 hours or more?
Again, I don't think of it that way. The data show that there is no upper limit to the benefit that comes from increased fitness, increased muscle mass, increased strength, especially increased cardio fitness. We see no upper bound to that limit. This is kind of unusual in biology, right?
Interesting.
Most things in biology are use and upside down use. Most of biology is the Goldilocks principle. Cardiorespiratory fitness is an exception to that rule. It's one of the exceptions. So, I think that everything you said before is correct. And when we start with people who don't exercise at all, we just peg them at 3 hours a week. Because that increment alone provides the biggest improvement that you'll see from any 3-hour addition. So going from completely sedentary to 3 hours a week of exercise will reduce your risk of all-cause mortality by 50%. So that's a staggering improvement. And if I never get you to take another step beyond those 3 hours a week, we've still won the game. But you're exactly right. Virtually without exception, those people 6 months later, 9 months later are like, this is freaking awesome. I want to do more of this.
Yeah.
So,
and you've seen this in your practice,
right,
like with patients over and over again. Yeah.
I'm getting stronger. My aches and pains are actually going away. Counterintuitive, right? They sort of had this thing, which is, I'm going to kind of coddle myself, my aches and pains. I'm going to do less. And the reality of it is, there's nothing that's better for reducing chronic pain than exercising safely. Now, look, everything comes with a nuance here. Can you exercise too much? Absolutely. Can any amount of exercise, if done incorrectly, increase long-term risk? Absolutely. But, again, the luxury I think we have is we have the ability to be nuanced and thoughtful in our approach. So, it's a broader discussion, of course, but whether 6 hours is the right number for you, or 7 hours or 8 hours or 10 hours is a function of what else it's competing with. And that doesn't just include other activities such as, attention to your nutrition or work, but it includes other things that are equally important, such as your relationships and connection to other people. By the way, the one thing I didn't address in your question is, where does the racquetball and stuff fit in? I would not include that in the 6 hours. So the 6 hours is dedicated to training. Racquetball is a sport. That's an activity. That's part of why you train, is to be able to do that. So I would just say the 6 hours I would like from you to be the training, and then, play your sports, your tennis, racquetball, whatever outside of it. And by the way, you'll be better at those things as well, and your risk of injury will be lower.
And how many hours a week are you exercising?
So I'm at kind of a low number by my standards now, in part because of the book and just other things that are a huge demand on my time. I'm trying to think. I'm probably at 10 hours a week right now. I think for me, the sweet spot's about 14. I perform at my best and feel my best at about 14 hours per week. So I'm kind of undertrained at the moment and a little bummed out about it. But you also have to keep in mind, like, I have a much different training age than most people. Up until my early 40s, I was training over 20 hours a week. And there were periods of my life as a teenager, which is really when I think you lay a lot of the foundation in the muscle. I was training 36 to 40 hours a week as a teenager, from about the age of 13 to 19.
And this was as a young boxer, and then subsequently as a swimmer, setting new records, swimming 32 kilometers.
Yeah, and as a cyclist later on. So there's always been something that has been very high volume training, and I'll never go back to that volume. I don't pine for that at all. And actually, in some ways, what I'm enjoying now is the mental act of trying to be more flexible in my thinking and acknowledging that there's a season for everything, and right now is not the season for me to be absolutely crushing it in every workout, and learning how to read my body a little bit more. Yeah. So again, I don't think I'm necessarily the person you should be saying, okay, well, whatever Peter does, I'm going to do, because that's not necessarily, necessary.
And I think there are ways to work the exercise into our lives. I walk a fair amount living in New York City, and ride bicycles a fair amount, although the new electric bikes are very tempting. It's a problem for me. But I was very interested in rucking, which is something which is basically walking or hiking with a weighted backpack up to a third of your body weight. I actually purchased the first step kind of inexpensive rucking system, which is a series of sandbags that I could fill before I go to the $350 full rucking system. But I like the idea that I could go to pick up my kid at school, about a mile and a half walk and back, 3 miles round trip, listen to audiobooks, podcasts, which is part of my work, right? There are ways of integrating this into your life such that it's not a zero-sum game of not being able to accomplish the other things you want to do.
Yep.
I think one of the things that to me was most surprising about your exercise suggestions is the amount of strength training. If you were to speak to what is most misunderstood about the benefits of exercise. I think cardio is more broadly appreciated as something that's really good for us. It seems like the strength training might be the piece that is not as widely understood.
Yeah. Cardio has all of these amazing metabolic benefits. It's by far the most important tool we have to increase insulin sensitivity. And insulin sensitivity, meaning the ability of the muscles to be receptive to the signal of insulin to bring glucose out of the circulation into the muscle, is an absolute hallmark of avoiding or delaying death. And cardio training has no peer in that regard. But what strength training does is partially factor into that. You see, strength training increases the capacity of the muscle as a reservoir for glucose. So a bigger muscle, all things equal, is a bigger sink for glucose. So
interesting. Yeah.
So you get all these benefits metabolically. You also get many of the same, chemical benefits that you're getting, the endocrine benefits, the cognitive benefits that you're getting from cardio training. But where strength training is imperative and where it has no peer is on the structural side. And this is with respect to bone density and strength. And those two things decline so much when we age, especially in women. So women are more susceptible to this because of hormone loss, that if we were ever going to add another horseman to the list, it would be accidental death, of which falling is the biggest cause of accidental death in the person over 65. So that's a very close competitor for a fifth horseman. Once you're over 65, if you fall, and in the course of that fall, break your hip or your femur, there's a 15 to 30% chance you will be dead in 12 months. Worth repeating. It's so staggering. If you're over 65 and you fall and break your hip or femur, there's a 15 to 30% chance, depending on the study, you're not going to be alive in a year. And of the people who are still alive in a year, 50% of them will never regain complete movement.
Wow.
So even if you're lucky enough to live, you're debilitated for life. You have lost some critical capacity. It's just hard to overstate this. And my kind of glib way that I explain this to patients who are somewhat resistant is, all right, so I don't know what the estimate is for how many billion people have lived, but I think it's 20 billion people we think have lived in all of human history. Mm-hmm. So I just said, just give me an estimate, just ballpark for me. Of those 20 or 30 billion or whatever the number is, how many of them do you think in the last year of their life said, I wish I had less muscle mass? What do you think that number is? I'll tell you what it is. 0. 0 times is how many times in human history someone in the last year of their life said, I wish I had less muscle mass. You can't have too much muscle at the end of your life.
So interesting. And what do you think about, I have been under the impression that ultra marathon runners die earlier, that there's such a thing as too much cardio, and that when you see crazy jacked bodybuilders, that bodybuilders die a bit earlier. That might be,
I think those are both probably true. Yeah. So again, the crazy jacked bodybuilder is probably dying not from how much muscle he has, but from what he had to do to get that much muscle. I've actually, sat down with a number of these guys, and I'm not being judgmental. I'm just insanely curious about what they need to do to get there. Most people, I think, look at, bodybuilders and think, well, they're just kind of freaks and they just take a bunch of drugs. And yeah, they are genetic freaks. And yeah, they take a bunch of drugs, but they're training and eating like you can't believe it. So there's nothing really healthy about anything they're doing. So I always want to make sure people don't use the excuse of the 300-pound bodybuilder dies prematurely, therefore I shouldn't lift weights. No, that's the wrong interpretation. Similarly, you're right. I think, obviously, Chris McDougall wrote that book, Born to Run, and there's a very famous example of the protagonist of that book who did die, and probably died from either a cardiomyopathy or an electrical failure of the heart due to the heart getting stretched out a little bit. We do see a slightly higher incidence of atrial fibrillation and cardiomyopathy in people who are exercising very, very excessively. But again, I find it a little disconcerting when people who are couch potatoes use those people as the counterexample to why they don't want to do it. So I'm more than happy to talk to the patient who's doing 90 miles a week of running and get them to back off. I'm happy to have that discussion. But yeah, it shouldn't be used as the excuse to not do it. For 99.99999% of people, they don't even have the capacity to push as hard as those two extremes are pushing, and they shouldn't worry about it.
I can assure you, Peter, this is not a risk for me. There's no ultramarathon or bodybuilding excessive risk for me. I'm a little disappointed that you're not giving me credit for my squash and tennis workouts in my 6 hours. But we'll
and again,
later.
I love that you're doing that because I think that play is important, right? And I think that type of stuff is great. The reason I think it's hard for me to put it in your 6 hours is the sweet spot around exercise is when you control the energy system. And the difficulty of doing that in any sort of sport like squash or tennis is it's very up and very down, right? So your training effect is
it's interval training.
But it's not just interval training. It's inconsistent interval training where you're never at a high enough intensity for long enough to get the true VO2 max building, and you're never low enough for long enough to get the plateau or the aerobic base building. So again, there's nothing wrong with that. But if we're truly trying to optimize your energy systems around long-term things, we want to be able to train in a very specific way. So specificity is very important. Again, it's not an accident that I've called it the centenarian decathlon. A decathlete is generally regarded as the best athlete overall, but they're not the best at any one thing. So they're a generalist who's very good at a bunch of things, never the best, but think about the specificity with which that athlete has to train to accomplish that feat. And so it really is kind of I used to refer to it as the centenarian Olympics when I first started talking about this 5-6 years ago. But I realized that the centenarian decathlon is a much better mental model.
All right, that's our show. Peter Attia is the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, OUTLIVE, The Science and Art of Longevity, and he'll be back next Thursday to talk with me about why most diet advice is bad, how to perfect the art of a good night's sleep, and why you should think about your mental health as part and parcel of your overall health. If you found this episode useful, you may want to share it with your friends and family. I am sharing this one with quite a few people because I would like all of us to be around and healthy as long as possible. As always, we'd be thrilled if you'd leave us a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. It really helps us get the word out. We'd also love it if you would download the Next Big Idea app. We've loaded that baby up with thousands of audiobook summaries written and read by the authors themselves, exclusive video and audio e-courses from folks like Daniel Pink and Susan Cain, ad-free versions of this podcast, and our other show, The Next Big Idea Daily, and lots of other mind-enhancing, mood-boosting, knowledge-expanding content. Search for Next Big Idea in your app store right now. And if you're listening to this and still haven't gotten your dad a Father's Day gift, why not consider a subscription to our hardback book club? Our legendary curators, Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, Susan Cain, and Daniel Pink, handpick the 2 very best books every season and mail them to your dad's front door. If that sounds like something he'd like, use the code DAD20, that's DAD20, for 20% off at nextbigideaclub.com. Today's episode was produced by Caleb Bissinger, sound designed by Mike Toda. You know what we hope we can still do when we're in our 90s? Work with the team at LinkedIn. I'm Rufus Griscom. See you next week.